All right, it looks like we have a good group of attendees right now and continue saying hello in the chat, but I will go ahead and get started with today's seminar. My name is Yvette Seeger, and I am the Director of Science Policy at the Federation of American Societies for Experimental Biology. And I am so honored to moderate today's seminar on researcher perspectives on improving data sharing and reuse. As you are likely aware, this is just one seminar in part of a year-long seminar series focused on data sharing for scientific societies. So I mentioned that I'm with the Federation of American Societies for Biology, or for Experimental Biology, or FASB, and we are a coalition of 30 biological and biomedical scientific societies that are focused, share our advocacy strategies as well as science policy advocacies. And how we got involved with this group is through our science policy committee. We wanted to do more exploration on what we could do as a group of societies in data sharing and reuse. So I'm really excited about today's topic. In addition to my organization, FASB, there are 10 total member societies as part of this group. And so we are joined in organizing this by AAAS and Science Magazine, the American Astronomical Society, the American Chemical Society, the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, specifically the Board on Data Stewardship, the Council of Scientific Society Presidents, the Federation of Associations in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, and we're so delighted to welcome our newest member, the British Ecological Society. And it's a great collaboration to pull all these seminars together, led by Shelley Stahl and Laura Lyon at the American Geophysical Union. As I mentioned, at FASB, we are excited to be a part of this group. This is an emerging area of our portfolio. Those of you who joined us for the June seminar heard a preview of what FASB is planning in terms of building a workspace focused on data reuse and just facilitating culture change. So I'm really excited for today's session. And our speakers today, without further ado, are Dr. Sarah Nusser and Dr. Alyssa Mikytuck. I will go over their brief bios and then I will turn it over to them. So Dr. Sarah Nusser is a professor emerita of statistics at Iowa State University and affiliated with its Center for Survey Statistics and Methodologies, which she has directed for 15 years. Sarah is currently a visiting research professor at the University of Virginia Biocomplexity Institute in the Social and Decision Analytics Division, and a senior fellow at the Association of American Universities, or AAU. Dr. Nusser's current research focus, which we'll hear about today, is on improving the reusability and impact of publicly accessible research data. And we'll hear a lot more in today's presentation. Her prior work focused on survey statistics and methodology for land-based and population-based surveys. In addition to her research, Dr. Nusser is actively involved in efforts to promote open science, transparency, and public access to research data. Two highlights that I've plucked from her bio are chairing the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine Board on Research Data and Information, and having leadership roles in the AAU Association of Public and Land Grant Universities, or APLU, initiative on accelerating public access to research data, or APARD, since its inception in 2017. Dr. Nusser is joined by her colleague who was a postdoc with her at the University of Virginia Biocomplexity Institute, Dr. Alyssa Mikytuck. Really excited to share that Dr. Mikytuck is going to be broadcasting from her brand new office since she is now an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Randolph-Macon College. She earned her PhD in psychology with a concentration in human development and public policy from Georgetown University, as well as a master's in public policy from the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown. Her research uses both quantitative and qualitative methods with diverse data sources, such as administrative data, surveys, interviews, and in her policy research. And so we are absolutely delighted to have both Drs. Nusser and Mikytuck with us today to speak about their recent work to identify researcher practices that promote data reusability and reduce researcher burden. This work is supported by a National Science Foundation EAGER grant, the goal of which is to identify and recommend a path for accelerating the readiness of the research community to effectively share and reuse data. I will turn it over to you, Dr. Nusser and Dr. Mikytuck.
Thank you very much, Yvette. I appreciate the introduction and the honor of being able to present in this seminar series. I've been able to watch almost all of them, and I've learned a tremendous amount, and we hope to contribute to the conversation. I want to give a shout out to Martin Halbert, who is the program officer who's funded this research, and to our colleague Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld, who has been instrumental in various aspects of the research, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit. Next slide, please. Next slide. Thank you. Yeah. To frame our discussion today, I wanted to start with this graphic from the AAU-APLU project that articulates the researcher and the ecosystem that surrounds them and influences their actions. And I want to give a shout out especially to AAU and APLU for fostering a lot of change in institutions about how researchers are supported in that context. And today we want to make links to societies in particular out of the external ecosystem. You know, I found as former vice president for research at Iowa State that often researchers identify more with their professional societies and disciplines than they do with their institutions. And societies have a huge role to play in helping to develop more robust practices for data sharing. And that's part of what we will be talking about today. The next slide, please. As Yvette indicated, the purpose of our work was really to figure out how we can help researchers do a better job with data sharing. And as part of, again, the former VPR at Iowa State, I really struggled with whether we were doing enough to help researchers. Through the AAU and APLU project, we were able to implement initial infrastructure, but what should researchers really be supported with? And so this grant was aimed at addressing some of those questions. For example, were researchers actually thinking about the reuser when they were creating their shared data? And if they are to do that, what is needed to make a data source more reusable to a researcher, with the idea that that would promote data use and impact for the producer of the data. The second area we were interested in is it was very clear that researchers felt a lot of burden associated with sharing data, but also they didn't always have experience. We've really asked many types of researchers to change their research practice if they did not already have a data sharing practice as part of their field. And so what could we do to help them reduce their burden while trying to increase data reusability? And the third was to really think about, based on that work, what can be done by various stakeholders in the ecosystem to increase community readiness. In tackling these questions, we really were intentional about going across disciplines. So the idea was to really think more in the vein of a framework or an architecture that described the research process more generically, with the idea that societies and funders and other stakeholders could really help tailor that larger infrastructure or architecture to the local field. Next slide, please. So to answer our questions, we engaged in quite a bit of information gathering. We conducted semi-structured interviews with about 20 researchers who were recruited from institutions that were participating in the APARD, or the AAU and APLU project. In addition, we partnered with Joel Kutcher-Gershenfeld to facilitate a workshop, and he had experience doing surveys of society members as stakeholders. And so we worked with Joel to do a survey of members of societies for those who were able to join us. So there were about 10 societies in total. Some were able to send email invitations, others through their newsletters, and we ended up getting about 1,600 responses. And a shout out to the societies on this seminar who participated in that. One of the things that was really interesting about these two sources of information is the similarity in both the composition of the researchers that were responding as well as the results. So in both the interviews and the surveys, the participants varied greatly in terms of their scholarly field, their career stage, and the type of institution, which was of great interest to us since we wanted to generalize our results across fields to the extent possible. The other thing that we observed that in both the survey and in the interviews, most researchers were both sharing and reusing data. Nearly a third were only reusing data, and only about 10% were only producing data. The other activity that we engaged in was to take the results that we had at the end of May and present them to about 35 researchers. Many of these researchers were nominated by the societies that in this particular seminar series, as well as the ones that participated in the survey. And we presented results and discussed issues and potential paths forward. On the third session, they were joined by about 40 stakeholders that were mainly societies and funders to talk about those their thoughts and what should be prioritized going forward. And so we'll be drawing from all three of these information gathering activities in our presentation. Next slide. So the focal areas we're going to talk about today are areas that really could use a lot more conversation. The first is really anticipating what reusers need to make effective use of data, articulating that a little bit more carefully. And then producer practices that can reduce burden and facilitate quality in both data and the research process. And the third is tracking downstream data use and impact. And so to start us off, Alyssa is going to begin with our first topic.
You can go to the next slide. So I'll talk about data producers' anticipation of reusers' needs. So you can go to the next slide. In the survey of researchers, we asked how important and how easy it is to ensure clear, accurate, and complete data documentation are associated with the shared data. Researchers noted that this was very important. On average, they gave it a 9 out of 10, where 10 indicated the highest importance. Excuse me. However, they also noted this was not easy. They gave it just a 2.8 out of 10, where again, higher numbers indicate more ease. And this discrepancy between high importance and low ease really indicated to us that this was a pain point for researchers in an area that could be greatly improved. Next slide. While the surveys provided a breadth of responses across societies, like Sarah mentioned, the interviews allowed us to understand the users' and producers' experiences in much more depth. So in discussing supplemental information associated with shared data, users noted that they may find a relevant data source, but without proper supplemental documentation, be unable to use it. So for example, this researcher noted that they would read papers that mentioned a data set, seemed relevant, and then when they found the data set, realized that it was not properly annotated, meaning that it did not have the contextual documentation they needed to use it. And without that, it was useless to them. And this can be seen in other fields as well, where researchers commented that even if they had the raw data, if they didn't have the metadata, they couldn't reuse that data source. Now, if producers were able to be responsive about providing this information, this may not be as big of a problem, but users lamented that producers could be unresponsive to data or data clarification requests, including requests for supplemental information. Next slide. That's not to say that producers just don't care about providing supplemental information, but that it's difficult for them to anticipate what reusers will need and which pieces of information they should focus their time and attention on. Because of course, many things are created during a research project, and making each of those things reusable to another person takes time and effort. For example, this producer said, "I'm sure there's things we didn't share, but it wasn't intentional." Where they chose to focus their effort and their attention was making sure that reusers were able to recreate published figures and findings with the information that they provided. Providing guidance to producers on what to share is important because, of course, their time and attention is limited, and this helps them prioritize their efforts. Next slide. So Faniel and colleagues have provided some guidance into what context needs to be provided for reusers. So on the left of this table, we have different assessments that data reusers complete. And then on the right, we have the context that needs to be provided for them to do that. So just taking this first line as an example, we have reusers assessing if the data source is relevant to their study objectives. And in order to do that assessment, they need to know the study objectives, understand the methodology, and they might do that by reading through a publication that has that information. It would be beneficial to provide what sort of expectations reusers have, similar to this table, so that producers can take a standard approach to provide that context. Next slide. So repositories also have a role in helping guide producers in their approach, and they can do this by establishing a set of expectations per repository. So the Biocomplexity Institute at UVA, where I did my postdoc, hosted a data science for the public good summer program, where graduate and undergraduate students conduct stakeholder-led research. And as part of our NSF grant, and in collaboration with Martin Halbert, we had students profile repositories and identify highly reusable data sets within those repositories this summer. And we have Kaggle and K&B highlighted here, which are just two of the repositories that students profiled. And we have them highlighted because they provide a usability rating and a metadata assessment report, respectively. The usability rating helps producers and reusers understand quickly how reusable a data source is according to the Kaggle metrics, which has things like, is a license specified, is the provenance specified? And it really gives producers kind of immediate feedback into if something they shared either is or is not highly reusable based on these metrics. Similarly, the metadata assessment report goes through and checks if uploaded items pass certain metric checks. And if it doesn't, it highlights exactly where it failed. So for this item that we have on the screen, the publication date and method section were not present. So it also gives a quick indication of what the producer needs to fix to pass that metadata check. Next slide. So our practice recommendation broadly in this focal area is to develop a more articulated standard for what needs to be shared with data so that researchers have guidance on what to prioritize. Societies can facilitate this by spearheading the definition of field-specific data documentation expectations. Journals and repositories can require standard documentation for shared data and evaluate if that was provided. And then repositories can assess the potential usability of the data source, like Kaggle, K&B, and others are already doing. And I'll turn it over to Sarah to talk about our next focal area.
Thanks very much, Alyssa. Next, we want to turn to the practices that reduce burden and facilitate quality in data sharing. And many researchers really struggle with the work of data sharing, but they also have concerns about reputational risks, that when they share data and code and other elements with their research project, that people will discover mistakes or use their information to criticize their work. So early in the project, we suspected that researchers may not be thinking early enough about the process to actually capture the context that was needed or check their shared data to provide mitigation of those kinds of concerns. Next slide. So when we asked interview participants when they started taking steps to facilitate data sharing, quite a few indicated that they wish they had started earlier. They noted that attending to sharing tended to occur at the back end of the research process, and that tended to limit how much they were willing to share or prepared to share with the public. The other thing that happened is some researchers got to the end of the process and they chose to use repositories that demanded less of them, less information shared with the data, less data. And so the issue with this is they were often depositing in repositories that were less visible and did not facilitate reuse. We also spoke with researchers who had more experience with data sharing, and they were very firm in indicating that planning must occur early before data collection. For example, to decide upon the details of data capture and documentation in a team-based environment. They also noted that it was important to start early in order to do a quality job of making data available. Next slide. In our survey, we also asked respondents about how important or easy is planning for how data will be documented and shared before you start your research study. And this is actually one of the more moderate results in our survey. A lot of our results were 9, 10 on, or 8 to 9 on importance and 3 on easy. Here, people said that it was reasonably important and reasonably difficult to do this. And I think this is actually a signal that more work is needed more focus is needed on the importance of promoting good research practice through planning. We found in our interviews that researchers had often had trouble explicitly talking about the planning process and what they had thought about in order to share data. Next slide. Our more experienced interview participants shared a number of strategies that helped them in the planning process. One that I've heard in other venues as well was to focus on one's own reuse as a vehicle for defining what needed to be captured. So for example, one researchers thought about their lab 5 years out when there might have been a complete turnover and they wanted to return to the data or repeat a methodology, and that helped them define what detail they needed in order to pick this up again when memory probably wasn't going to help them. Another researcher focused on prototyping the data sharing process inside their lab. This provided the basis for an easier transition to making data publicly accessible, as well as really helping make sure that the shared products were of higher quality because they were scrutinized ahead of time, and the graduate students were really being taught about this practice early on in their career. A number of researchers have found that they benefited from adopting increasing levels of standardization and automation as they gained experience. They learned to plan out the workflow ahead of time to standardize the process and the data capture. They adopted or created various kinds of standards for the variables that they were collecting or the formats that they were using. And some were able to develop algorithms to automate data intake and cleaning as well as analysis. It's hard to really understate the importance of this workflow approach with pipelines and standards and automation for reducing burden and improving rigor and data quality based on some of the conversations we had with researchers. Next slide. But a lot of researchers are really not operating with an understanding of workflows or tools needed to implement them. And as part of our survey, we asked researchers whether they agreed or disagreed with the statement that there's currently sufficient knowledge and training in their primary field or discipline on softwares and tools that can reduce burden in producing and documenting research data. And clearly only about a quarter felt like they had the available resources in order to learn this. Next slide. So we know that planning is important and that workflow approaches could help us reduce effort and improve consistency, but most people don't know how. So in our workshop discussions, we looked into this area, and I wanted to highlight a few areas around capacity building. There was quite a bit of interest in articulating a standard data preparation and sharing process as the basis for planning and executing research studies. There was also, not surprisingly, a broad interest in how we training mechanisms for the skills and tools needed to engage in workflow planning and automation. But the ideas that were raised in the workshop varied depending upon the type of individual. And we probably need all three of these approaches. Some advocated for the idea that we would train graduates and undergraduates in open science practice so that they were basically ready to operate in this mechanism by the time they were professionals. There was also a strong interest in training for all career stages. We certainly encountered mid-career researchers who wanted to adopt these practices, but really did not have a place to start or training available to them to learn even the basic things like how to use a Jupyter notebook. Another thread of conversation was really thinking about our teams differently, to include a research data expert with both disciplinary and data science knowledge as a primary team member, and really give them the weight as co-investigator that they deserve in terms of ensuring the quality of the information and the reusability of data that are produced. And the third area is one that's been underway thanks to the Association of Research Libraries and the AAU-APLU project, which is to establish research data services in research institutions. There's a comparable effort in the EU around data stewardship competency centers. And these are, again, people who are familiar with data science and curation that in some cases have disciplinary expertise that would be useful to specific research projects. Next slide. So at this point, it's clear that we need to adopt early planning for the how, or the methods of documenting data for reuse and promoting data quality. I think most researchers, in fact, the vast majority of them, think very hard about how they design their study, but this layer of methodology needs to be attended to a little bit more carefully. It's also important that we figure out how we can develop an automated workflow mindset, basically defining the research process as a standardized and to the degree possible automated approach to collecting and checking data and information. So I would say that this is an area that really is needing more conversation rather than it's clear what the next action step is. And so I think the societies and funders could be really important to convening discussions to really forward this topic. What elements should be in a planning process to leverage automated workflows for document development and data capture. And then we need to think about realistic, sustainable approaches to adopting these kinds of approaches. Is it that you train an individual? Is it that you have professionals on your team that serve as co-investigators, or are you relying on services or some other method? Okay, let me kick this back to Alyssa for our third topic.
All right, thanks. So I'll talk about tracking downstream data use and impact. Next slide, please. So on the survey, researchers were asked the extent to which they agreed with the following statement: the tenure, promotion, and rewards in my organization recognize and value researchers for sharing data. And on a 0 to 10 scale, where 10 indicated a high level of agreement, we had 26% of researchers select 0 to indicate that they strongly disagreed, and they perceived that their efforts were not recognized or valued. This was reiterated in the workshop when researchers highlighted that data is not treated as a first-class research output. When we ask researchers to engage their time and effort in data as a first-class research output, as is needed to effectively share, we're asking them to do things that they're not rewarded for presently. Next slide. One way researchers might be rewarded for sharing data is through citations of that data, and that can be tracked like publication citations. In the interviews, we asked reusers how, if at all, they cited the data, and some noted they cited the publication rather than the data. So the original paper was easily referenced, and there's a format or expectation for citing that, just like any other publication. And another researcher noted that they described the data source and provided a citation for the survey protocol document and listed the website where the data could be accessed. But as has been discussed in this group, and you guys might be aware, that that's not always kept in by all journals. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there. Next slide. In the interviews, we also asked producers how, if at all, they kept track of reuse. So did they keep track of downloads or citations or some other way? And generally, we found that researchers were not tracking or were not able to track reuses of their data. So we asked this researcher if they had a sense of reuses, and they said, no, they didn't have a good idea of that. The only way they could track it was if someone reached out to them with a question about the data, because then they would know that someone was at least interacting with it. but there was nothing at a systems level to tell them that it was being reused. And this is a trade-off that repositories face. By not requiring users to register to download a data set, they've effectively reduced the burden that users face in accessing that data, but then producers cannot or have difficulty tracking at any level who is using that data. So it's a trade-off that they face between users and producers' needs. Next slide. So what are researchers rewarded for related to their data? Well, we all know there is an enormous bias in favor of publications. So a question that we've grappled with is what would drive data sharing to be treated as a first-class research output? One thing we might need is the ability to assess the data output in terms of researchers' contribution, quality of shared output, and its impact. And right now it's not clear, at least broadly across fields, how these attributes are assessed for data and where that information comes from, which has led us to ask if there should be some sort of peer review process for data, although the specifics on what and how that would look like or operate are not clear at this point. Next slide. So our practice recommendations for reusers is to cite data and credit the producers. For producers, our recommendation is to select repositories that collect information so that they can evaluate the impact of their shared data, as well as document their shared data and its reuses in their CV with a section on their CV, just like they do with publications. We think that societies could facilitate these recommendations by defining how data contributions, quality, and impact will be assessed. Journals and repositories can establish expectations and standard paths for citations and credit, as well as monitor and share downstream actions of shared data. And then funders can value shared data and impact metrics in their proposals and progress reports as ways for agencies to reward the efforts associated with data sharing mandates. And back over to Sarah.
Thank you very much. Next slide, please. So thus far, we've talked about increasing the producer's understanding of what context needs to be shared with the data, some of the promising practices for reducing burden and fostering quality, and about creating a more functional citation and credit system to provide the reward that really producers deserve and need in order to engage in this work. And so to close the presentation, we wanted to share a few things from our workshop discussions that focus on what vision should we aspire to that was part of the researcher discussions, as well as some suggested actions that build on some of the things we've already talked about. Next slide. We engaged in a discussion with researchers and asked them to put together elements of a shared vision of success. And here are four of our favorite elements of that. The first is that data sharing is rigorously executed and an expected part of research across fields and disciplines. In addition, infrastructure for automation of metadata generation, and I would add data capture and checking, is built into digital tools used in the research process. In addition, when people had visions around what happened when you read a data set or you visited a poster, that there would be a link of some kind that would allow you to open up the data source, the code would be available, and you could begin looking at the data in real time. And a really important element that came up over and over again, that the creation and curation of data is valued as much as clever analyses. Next slide. Building on some of the things that we've already discussed about, I just wanted to highlight three things that came out of our stakeholder alignment discussion. As we mentioned, we're really interested in thinking about standards, both in and specifications. So it's going to be very important that we think about what's the contextual documentation needed, what kind of formats are beneficial. I haven't really talked today about open standards and standards period, although that was a large part of the discussion. What kind of citation information is important, what repository features foster data sharing, all towards the idea that these elements need to come together in order for data to have impact. And again, the societies really have an important role to play here, because while we can specify sort of generically what might be beneficial, the rubber meets the road in fields that have specific types of data and cultures around their data collection. The second element, which has been talked about in the seminar series already, is to take that understanding about what the standards should be and ensure that they're shared in journal settings that are hosted by the societies and others. And in particular, this is a great venue for thinking through the community-based discipline-specific practices for data sharing. And there was very strong interest in this particular group of making sure that this, once it was sort of set, that it got built across all the journals in a particular field. And finally, how do we get to this treating of data as a first-class product? And a lot revolves around this pretty broken credit and tracking system. And so an interesting suggestion out of these two groups was to really return to the researchers. What kind of credit do they want to see, and what are the meaningful metrics for assessing that? And then societies really have the opportunity to develop approaches for documenting and evaluating shared data in the context of their particular field that can be used not only for academic promotion and tenure processes, but other kinds of reward processes, including how funders treat both proposals and awards. And so with that, I want to thank you, both of us want to thank you for your attention. Next slide. We appreciate the opportunity to present, and we're happy to take questions and begin looking through the chat.
All right, well, that was absolutely wonderful. I just want to thank both Sarah and Alyssa for walking us through that. I don't know about, well, you can tell by the chat, but my brain is definitely pinging through all of the ideas and threads that I've heard from our membership. And I have lots of thoughts, and as you can see going through the chat, our audience has lots of thoughts as well. Please keep up the discussion in the chat, and I will help parse through that. But also, if you would like to unmute and ask your question, use the raise hand function. But you know, I think the one point that really stuck out to me on your last slide is data as a first-class product, and I know it's not even a question, it's just a reiteration. None of these papers, the publications that are considered the premier thing for promotion and tenure, we wouldn't have them without data. And so, you know, just the phrasing of that bullet just struck me so much as you were completing all of your information. One thread that also came through in the chat was, and I echo it, was the appreciation for the targeted recommendations through your research already for societies, defining a clear role and knowing that we have culture change. So, you know, going back from the beginning, you know, one question that came up later, and I might as well bring it up at the front, is I think you definitely have a bought-in audience here, understands the importance of data sharing. How do we make sure this gets paid for? I certainly hear this from my constituents, and I know I'm not alone. What are you hearing, and what sort of recommendations came out of your consultations for covering it?
That actually was a gigantic concern in the workshop. And as is easy to do when you are not the purse holder, people recommended that funding sponsors, whether it's federal agencies or others, put more money into this. And there's conversation around a couple different elements. The most, at least federal agencies, by virtue of the Holder memo, are really required to fund the cost of preparing data and putting it out there. But there's a big issue around repositories and you know, the long-term infrastructure and so on. So so the idea of sponsors, whether they're federal or nonprofit or private, investing in longer-term infrastructure is very important. It's also just generally not paid enough attention to. So that's a huge culture shift in the funding world. I'll just note, those of you who are on the call from Europe, that the EU, through the Go Fair process and all of the change that's going on, has recommended that 5% of a grant should be just shunted off to the long-term stewardship of the data. So looking at models like that is really important. I'll also note that it's of interest to the Board on Research and Data Information of the academies to think about a broader research and data infrastructure. It's an active topic of discussion right now. Alyssa, did you want to add anything?
Well, I wanted to speak a little bit about an earlier point you made about kind of the value of this data. And I think David Schultz made that in the chat as well, that we don't right now have a great way of quantifying the value of data in these efforts. And I think another person in the chat mentioned that, producing the data set can be equally important to publishing the papers, but it's the papers that are getting rewarded. We had interview respondents who noted that, 90% of their time and effort is the data. It's just the last 10% that's that publication. And that's what's, rewarded and shown as an indication of your effort. But really the majority of their time and effort was spent on the front end. So trying to think about how to value that as well. And I think we still have some work to do about how to quantify the value of data. And, there's a question of, does every data set need to be shared, or should it be shared? And I think that quantifying would help explain that.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so interesting. I know we're all going through the chat, but one point I did want to pull out is, we talked a lot about engagement of the researchers and the societies. There were some comments about engaging librarians. I'm not leaving the librarians out by any means, and also the data repository managers. Have you had any exploration in engaging those stakeholders through your work, or did that come up in your discussions as well?
We did not have discussions with big repositories, but a number of our respondents in the interviews had developed community repositories. And I think that just generally, people were not thinking about the downstream tracking of impact and use. And in fact, they tended to prioritize, we don't want it to be a burden for this to be used, so we're not gonna track anything. And so there's this, well-intentioned philosophy of making it easy to use the data, meaning you just go and get the data and nothing happens after that, versus the need to really add a little more structure to the process so that the cycle of credit and reward can be completed. And Alyssa might want to talk a little bit about the repository project this summer.
Yeah, so this summer, like I mentioned, we had students profile repositories. We had them look at multidisciplinary repositories as well as smaller community-based repositories, and identify highly reusable data sets within those. And what was interesting, I guess, in this, especially for the students to realize when they were finding this data, was that many repositories, they just couldn't get many metrics from. So it ended up not being a repository that we chose to profile for the project. Super interesting from our end because there wasn't metrics there, but they didn't really have anything that they could work with. So I think, highlighting Kane being Kaggle as an example of a repository that's giving the usability rating or metadata assessment report is really important because it just gives users and producers that immediate feedback and quick insight into a data source that they can fix if they want to fix that particular, if it failed a metadata assessment check. But it just gives them that quick insight without having to spend all of the time and effort to go through the data set and see if it will be useful, if it has the right information.
Great, thank you. And just a reminder to the audience, I am scrolling through your questions. They have the fastest typing fingers on the planet. And feel free, if there are questions that you, both of you see in the chat, feel free to pluck them out. But also, if you would like to unmute to ask your question directly so I don't slaughter it, just use the raise hand function. I'm trying not to miss anything. I'm trying to pull out threads. One that I'm picking up from the chat from Suzanne Johnson is, what about the quality of data reuse? I am a psychologist and can imagine problematic reuse of psychological data by non-psychologists. I would presume that this is a problem in other areas as well.
Yes, Alyssa, you're a psychologist. Why don't you go ahead and respond?
Yeah, and I'll note that actually one of our interviewees was a psychologist who noted that this was her concern in sharing data, was that she was worried that others were going to use her data to make points she disagreed with, or that they would use it inappropriately. And I think that there's just a category of concerns when you're sharing your data, and potential misuse is one of them. She found, and what we broadly found, was that that wasn't happening. It's not to say that it can't, but one way that I think she tried to protect against that was just by being very clear in her documentation about how the data were collected and what the measures indicated. So by providing all of that supplemental information so that it, was more difficult to, I guess, misinterpret, was one way that she addressed that.
Yeah, and we have not touched on, there's so many things we have not really touched on, but the whole issue of handling data that needs to be restricted in some way is a big thread, and was a huge part of the conversations with both interviewees and in our workshop. And as a statistician who's worked with federal agencies who have a pretty big machinery around producing data, sharing it, and limiting disclosure risk, this is a topic that also needs a lot of conversation, because if we're going to be preparing data en masse to share, at least as VPR at Iowa State, I tripped over almost immediately that there are people in other fields that haven't been trained on human subjects research and don't know how to deal with this. So what are the easier ways in order to protect information so it is not misused? And there are some very complicated ways to do that. But one of the things I was talking about with somebody on our APARD project actually just yesterday is that the idea of trusted repositories or data trusts as a vehicle to regulate access, rather than asking people to provide statistical disclosure limitation to their data set, is something that maybe institutions might want to explore. But it's a little bit like, how do you adopt workflows at a large scale level that needs a lot more conversation.
And I'll just add quickly that I saw someone add in the chat if we've come across informed consent problems in the reuse of human subjects data. And that was something that our interviewees certainly discussed. And it actually goes to Sarah's point about planning early, because if you don't include in the informed consent phase, when you're drafting it at the IRB, that you plan to reuse it and what your plan, or that you plan to share it and what your plan for doing that is, it might actually just not be possible for you to share your data. So that was something that we certainly did run into, and it's something that I think, argues for planning early and including that idea in the IRB or consent phase.
Yeah, and we talk a lot about that at FASB too, the planning early and thinking about all the things. But then I think there's just that inherent part of the scientist brains is like, oh, but what if something comes up serendipitously and we want to pursue that? And I think that's probably some of the challenge that, it's a bad excuse, but I'm sure that is part of I'm not sure about planning that far ahead because let's just see what happens. But anyway, that's my sidebar. I think going back to I think it was your second theme, there was a question from Jake Yeston about did adopting electronic lab notebooks come up as a way of facilitating data deposition?
Yes, there were, so I'll mention that in two threads. One is there were researchers that are, really this shows up more in the natural sciences that talked about the benefit of doing that and how they organized their materials. But there were also researchers in the social sciences that really appreciated the idea of a lab notebook as a vehicle for capturing what was happening, that tradition is not really present in most of the social sciences. The idea that you make, regular daily notes about what's going on in your research project. And that person had adopted that kind of approach. They had also realized that they needed to think more about workflows after their initial experience with trying to share data at the end of their project. So they identified resources, and basically the first thing his students did was to read a book on workflows so that they could do a better job of planning for data acquisition and integration.
Great. Yeah, no, I mean, I just think about science, and I'm a biologist, thinking about how we plan for research when you were doing everything by hand, and the shift to automation it's been a game changer on so many fronts, but it also changes the way you need to plan. So thank you for that. There was a comment about, and I know why, it's a difficult one. How do we address interagency and interorganization data sharing and reuse challenges? Did that come up in the conversation? And thinking just about process, when you deal with one federal agency here in the United States, you are dealing with one federal agency in the United States, and pieces might be able to be applicable to the next one, but it's not always. I was listening to political talk this morning, just like, it's amazing that there are IT systems for each agency and they don't necessarily talk to each other. I know, shocker in the US government, but but did that come up as a problem, even like within an institution, different departments and programs not being able to talk to? Did that come up as challenges, making this even harder?
Yeah, so let me reach back again to my former VPR experience. This was really a huge bane of our existence, to have different requirements, standards, forms from every single agency. And as a researcher myself, who was funded from multiple sources, it was very difficult to keep track and to know what to do. And actually, occasionally the sponsored programs people would call me and say, you need to do this for this one. So that is a gigantic problem, both for institutions as they help to support researchers, but also for researchers. And one that was noted very early on in the AAU APLU project through the Public Access Working Group report. I will say that in recent years, there's been efforts through the OSTP and the Subcommittee on Open Science to really work harder on this. It's not clear, from the public perspective, where they are on that process. I hear rumors that that's, progress is being made, but it's just hard to understate how important that is to making everybody's life easier. And I know when we thought about workflow of tracking data that needed to be shared, what we needed to monitor for compliance at Iowa State, what we really wanted was a data management platform, for example, that was universal across the agencies. So we would have one system that we were working with, and so on. So I think there's some actually reasonable low-hanging fruit, easy for me to say because I'm not in those agencies and dealing with the political and internal and external political dynamics. But this would be just a huge help to both researchers and organizations that support researchers.
And there's definitely been some pile-on in the chat. Sheena brought up not only just institutional and different agencies, but when you have multidisciplinary teams, which are so coveted, how do you figure out how to talk to each other? How do you agree where to deposit your data? And then Shelley made me LOL in my head with, for one grant, she has to have 5 different data management plans. It's like, I think, and you think about researchers getting into doing research, they want to do research. The paperwork and the planning is not always the draw to the PI type of position. So if it is, please raise your hand. But thinking, there is additional discussion about costs. Obviously, costs are a big pain point for researchers.
Can I pick up on the team science one?
Yes, please.
That's
sorry.
a super important. And sorry, it's just impossible to monitor the chat respond. But I look forward to reading the chat. We both do after the conversation. Team science is. The NIH did a lot of work, 10, maybe 15 years ago. National Academies put out a book on, basically team-based collaborations. And that's been really amplified by the focus on convergence and, highly interdisciplinary teams. And it's actually something, again, when I was at Iowa State, we put just a ton of effort on. We developed a team academy to help people understand all the hurdles they needed to get through in order to function well as a team. And so we didn't talk about that, but that's a really important aspect to just the execution of how this might work. And it really ties to the current focus on research climate, equity, sexual harassment, and so on, that if you can establish, you know, the basis for good interactions where credit is shared in appropriate ways, it is decided in advance, where the rules of the team members are respected, where it's, you know, diverse voices are sought, that takes problems down a notch that we're talking about that one has to deal with. So appreciate whoever brought that up.
And then I know we're getting near the end, and I know there are so many questions left unanswered, but don't worry, there's always that interaction afterwards. But this one kind of intrigued me. Are data forward journals like Scientific Data or GigaScience helping or non-starters in this effort? Are you seeing those niche data focused journals helping push everything forward?
You know, I don't have a good answer to that, but let me share a reflection from Birdie, particularly from Berit Mons in the EU, who's been very instrumental in the Go Fair project and is now part of also working with CoData. You know, besides just the radical reconceptualization of the research process that we're really trying to foster here, there's a whole idea of what is a research output. And I think it's extremely appropriate that we think about data as primary objects in themselves that may not need to have a publication, you know, that answers a research question next to them. And so to the extent that different kinds of concepts are promoted within the journal environment for prioritizing data or other kinds of research projects, I think that helps change the culture in the long run.
I'll just add quickly that, you know, I mentioned that producers or users sometimes lamented that producers were unresponsive to data requests or data clarification requests. And that was something that the interviewees noted that journals could really help enforce if they have a data sharing policy, that they, you know, do enforce that those data producers are sharing it so that you can access it, because that was not always the case. So obviously, their place is important, but just figuring out exactly what role they play and how that works, I think is still a discussion.
And I know we are nearing the end of our time here, and there are so many questions that are left unanswered, but I will just go back to a question that was early in the chat, and just because I can do the lead in on it, is, you know, there was the 2015 directive from the U.S. government about data sharing. You know, what is the tracking? You know, how is that being implemented? And is it helping, or is it one of these other directives that it's just like researchers are aware it's there, and until their feet are held to the fire, they're not going to do anything? What is your perception on that policy?
It made all the difference in the world, because it caused agencies to pick this up, you know, no matter how long it took them to pick it up. But now many agencies are prioritizing this, and the whole focus over the last few years about evidence-based policymaking and data as an asset that should be shared grows out of that. It's really the equivalent of the reports that came out in Europe. So as much as we hate mandates and requirements, they do force behavioral change.
Yes, and that was certainly for us being biologists, when NIH has put forward that it is going to have its requirements starting in 2023. That was our wake-up call, that no one was joking. So, you know, you can have carrots and sticks. All right, we are at the end of our time. And so I just want to thank our presenters again, Sarah Nusser and Alyssa Mikytuck, for sharing this amazing data and findings. And we could go on for at least another hour and still have plenty of things to talk about. Just a reminder, this session has been recorded and the slides will be posted to the WeShareData.org website. And as you can see on the screen, we are really excited to continue building on this conversation with the next seminar on September 3rd. The topic being culture change, how a research team made it happen, featuring our presenter, Elise Zipkin, the Ecology, Evolution, and Behavior Program Director at Michigan State University, and the Associate Editor of the Journal of Animal Ecology. Same time, same place, same bat channel. So hopefully you will tune in and continue this great discussion. And thank you all for participating.